Hello, my dear friend. Welcome back to another episode of the Reflective Parenting Podcast. Today, we are talking about boys and emotions. And so, if you are raising a boy, you need to hear this. I brought in somebody who studied teenage boys and heard from them in terms of what they needed and what they were looking for regarding their home environment and, most importantly, their relationship with their dad. This might be uncomfortable for some of us listening to this, especially if you have a child who's not being raised right now with a dad. And I'm saying this as somebody who experienced that. I want you to know that this is always information based to kind of increase your awareness around certain things. And this is the point of this episode. I want us to step back as parents and to reflect, which is what we are trying to do. We're becoming reflective parents. And as we scan our child's environment and say, okay, this is what my child needs from their father, maybe this means that you are a mom listening to this and saying, we need to have some important conversations around how we are supporting our son's emotions and consequently their future mental health. Or maybe you have a child that you are raising alone, as my mom did for my brother and I, and there is no dad who is present. He just left and never was involved. And so if you are hearing this, you can say or question, okay, what is it that they need from me that I can give them extra support? And how can I increase the conversations if I have a child who's older in terms of helping them find really strong, important male relationships? It is not the end all if they don't have a father figure, but how can we be more mindful of helping them find strong male relationships? I was very lucky that I had two of those growing up. And so, although my father wasn't present, I had a grandfather that acted as a father figure who was a very strong male figure. Didn't talk about his emotions, didn't say I love you, but his actions said it all and made me feel so seen and so connected to him and so heard. He was the only one I can speak with. In fact, he was the one I would go to speak and have conversations with. Although they were uncomfortable, I would always go see him because he listened. He gave me his full attention and he was always present. And I've said this a couple of times during the podcast. That's what saved me personally. Although there are still some consequences to having a father that left, with regarding my emotions or even parenting. I worked on this for many years now through therapy and also becoming a reflective parent myself. And that is what I'm sharing with all of you in the course that I'll be launching next week. Can you believe that today is episode 249? And next week at the launch of this course, we have been working so hard in the back end of all of this with the workbook, with the course. And yeah, I just can't share it. Can't wait to share it with all of you next week. Okay. So I'd like to introduce my guest and get you right into today's conversation because of how important it is. I had the opportunity to have a conversation with Dr. Brendan Kwiatkowski-Hartman, and he and I are both in an organization called the Men's Mindset Initiative. And because of our work specifically with men, for myself, it's with dads, but Brendan specializes in the social emotional development and well-being of boys and men, and how this connects to the well-being of all genders. His interdisciplinary work bridges sociology, psychology, and education to foster healthier relationships, emotional connection, and resilience in individuals, communities, and systems. I absolutely love his work, and what he shares is just so important for everyone to hear. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Brendan. And welcome back, everyone, to the Reflective Parenting Podcast. And as promised, I'm here with Brendan. Brendan, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'm excited for this conversation because I think that I need to have this conversation, not just the parents that are listening to this, but, here at Curious Neuron, we've been working with parents for many years now, developing self-awareness and talking about emotions. And your work is specific with dads, with sons, with boys and men. And so I'm curious, before we're going to get into it, to know, how did you end up in this area?
There's kind of three different tiers as to why I got into this. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the saying that all research is me search. And
No, I'm not.
okay, so I didn't realize that until afterwards. Retroactively, I
Makes
see
so
how
much
much
sense.
this was me search.
Yeah.
But from the surface level, I was a high school teacher near Vancouver, Canada, and I tended to be drawn towards students who were the opposite of me, and I was the good student, and so it was the disruptive students. I
Mm.
just kind of their lack of not people pleasing appealed to
Mm-hmm.
me. And it turns out that a lot of those students were boys. And
Mm.
when I dove into some of the research during my master's, I found out that 80% of students diagnosed with so-called emotional and behavioral disorders were male.
Mm.
And I went down to the records and looked at my high school's student records and found the exact same percentage. And I was like, okay,
Mm.
how much of this is biology? How much is socialization? And I think there's a role interaction with both, but it's undeniable from the empirical research that masculinity pressures given to boys and men contributes greatly to some of the emotional manifestations that we see
Right.
boys more likely to display.
That makes total sense. The me search. Not just the research, but I think the work that truly drives us. For myself, Curious Neuron is just really focused on supporting parents to make sure that they are okay and they are well, because we know that that is really important in the environment that the child is growing up in. And I was raised by two parents that were not well and struggled a lot with emotions, and so it makes a lot of sense. This angle that you said, yeah.
Yeah, I think that speaks to something I always say, like, we can't do this work without looking in the mirror.
Mm-hmm.
And
It's true.
so many of us never, I think that's the role of parents, is to be an emotional mirror for our children, but
Mm-hmm.
so many of us didn't experience our parents with a high level of emotional intelligence.
Mm.
There's a privilege, I think, of so much more knowledge around emotions that parents can kind of, for the first time, really grapple with what does emotional health look like from a holistic point of view, that some of our parents weren't afforded that because they were maybe more survival
Mm.
zone. And I think we can also get
It's true.
inundated with so much knowledge that
Mm.
prevents us from actually embodying or feeling our feelings. We can think about our feelings, but we might not be
Mm.
able to feel them.
Mm. There was a dad that I spoke with once, and he said, I don't think I have emotions. I know they're there somewhere, but he's like, I don't think they're like, I don't know what it feels like. And he's like, I wasn't raised in an environment where I was allowed to feel. And so it led to me now as a dad not really understanding what it feels like to be disappointed or sad. I know what mad feels like, but the rest are very um ambiguous to me. There's an app called How We Feel. Mark Brackett was part of that, and I said, let's just explore that. And thank goodness for the high energy or pleasantness, all of that. It kind of simplified the language for him. But being more specific than that was extremely difficult. So I'm curious to know on your end, and we're going to get into that. But on your end, I know you did research as well. What did you? I'm assuming your curiosity from the classroom led to that, and what did you learn from that?
So for my research, I compared the least emotionally expressive grade 12 boys to the most emotionally expressive grade 12 boys. And I compared their growing up experiences and their beliefs around masculinity to see how
Mm.
different or similar they were. And to summarize all of those findings is that they're far more similar than not. Um,
Mm.
the main difference is that the boys who were the least emotionally expressive, which means the least willing or able to talk to people in their lives about what they're going through or to express their emotions in any sort of way,
Mm.
they experienced significantly greater levels of loneliness. And I don't
Mm.
want people to think of loneliness meaning having no friends. A lot of these boys had a lot of friends, but it goes back to kind of Dr. Brene Brown's research that the opposite of belonging is fitting in. So these
Mm.
boys were lonely, but they were pretty good at fitting in, but they didn't have a sense of belonging. Whereas the
Right.
boys that were the most emotionally expressive, I in my research I called them emotional safe havens. They had
Mm.
anywhere from like 1 to 4 people in their lives that they felt that they could be their authentic selves around,
Mm.
at least as much as possible. But interestingly, even those most emotionally expressive grade 12 boys by age 18, all of them said that the transition period to high school was super difficult, and they all felt like they had to suppress their emotions during that stage.
Mm. So what does this kind of tell us, right? So as parents, I know that I tell parents to kind of model what emotion regulation looks like and to try their best, in terms of that. But many parents weren't raised, like you said, in an environment where parents were doing this for us. And now we're being told like it's important for our kids. And it's a really difficult situation that many parents are in. So what you've seen in the classroom and with younger boys, um, what can we learn from that as parents in terms of creating that safe space? Or how do we, maybe there's a parent listening to this saying, I don't think I've done that, I don't think I've been that person for my child or created that space for them. Where do I begin to make sure that they are able to express their emotions in a healthy way?
That's a great question. And there's two critical time periods to understand in a boy's development, where they're at a heightened risk of disconnecting from authentic parts of themselves. And those are primarily around their emotions. So around the age of 5 is when boys tend to get disconnected from their experiences of sadness and of
Mm,
fear. And even in how parents talk to their sons compared to how they talk to their daughters around those events, they use less emotional language. They're less likely to reflect, oh, like you felt scared by that or you felt sad by that. And just in general, parents use less emotional language with their sons than with their
mm,
daughters. And that's just kind of one level of it. But boys themselves already know that fear and sadness around age 5 are less acceptable for them to show.
mm,
And so some of that is like for sure just parents' awareness of how we talk to our
right.
children, but there's so many like subconscious biases as well. Um, that like the one thing I would love parents to take away is just understanding that boys are so deeply emotional
Mm,
and like they have emotionally rich lives. There's a good argument to be made in my own PhD research that the most emotionally restricted teenage boys were the most emotionally sensitive because
mm,
they were constantly surveying their environment of like, okay, whose emotions out there do I need to not burden them with my own feelings? What's the emotions like within myself that could leak out? And so I need to really clamp that down. Like I
mm,
had one teenage boy, and this surprised me. He loved snowboarding, but on a school field trip, he didn't try any of his risky moves that he wanted to try because he's like, in case I got hurt and in case I cried, I would never want that to
mm.
happen. So they're kind of both restricted in their emotions, but also hyper vigilant and aware of their emotions.
That's interesting. It makes sense as well, I think, with the kids and the parents that I've heard from, where even if I think of what's the name of the fear like around certain events, right? And just like social anxieties, like they're gonna pretend that everything's okay when they're not going to express that. And so it's kind of interesting to hear it that way. What would if a parent notices this, what's the sort of language that we should have with them?
Mm.
Because it's easy. So in the sense that if we notice that they are suppressing and trying to make it seem like everything's okay, it's easy to just say like express it, say it, right? But it's not going to happen that way. So what are the baby steps, the scaffolding to that?
Yeah, that's absolutely probably one of the worst and least effective ways. Um, like the teenage boys told me, like even at school, they're starting to get emotional education more frequently, but they're
Mm.
like almost every emotional education that we get is like talk about your feelings. And they
Uh,
hate that one
yeah,
because
of
they feel
course.
shame for not talking, but it also doesn't match their lived experiences. And so you
Mm,
have to understand the reasons why boys tend to suppress their emotions, because if you come at it from like just talk about it, it's like in their nervous system, in their bodies,
mm,
that doesn't feel like a safe thing
mm.
because they have learned in their life that that isn't a safe thing to do. All
Right.
behavior makes sense in the context in which it arises. And
Mm-hmm.
one of the assumptions I had into my research going in was that when I talked to the most emotionally restricted teenage boys, I thought some of them would say, I've always been this way.
Mm.
This is just who I am. But none of them said that. They all identified when and why they started to suppress their emotions. And the three main
Interesting.
reasons were fear of judgment from others,
Mm.
um, fear of being a burden was actually tied for the top
Right.
two. And so if they feel like their parents can't handle what's going on in their life, like maybe the boy's being bullied at school, but if he starts saying that, then you as a parent makes sense to go into freak out mode. But now all of a sudden he's now caretaking for your emotional well-being, and you're not that sturdy emotional
Right.
guide. Not telling parents to be robotic about it. Like, it makes sense that you're going to feel the pain that your child goes through, but as an adult, what I would so strongly encourage is for us to become our own emotional safe havens first, so that we can increase our capacity to tolerate our children's distress. And that requires us to tolerate our own distress and just be like, okay, my distress is coming up because my child is in pain. I might have all these parts that want to heal this, want to fix this, want to be like, minimize it, because maybe you growing up got bullied and you had to survive alone, and you found your resiliency through that, but you didn't have that guide. And so such a good gift to give your child is to not have to do things as difficult and as unsupported as you might have had to have done it. And that requires, sitting with your own distress, so that you can support them and be there for them. And so for practical advice to kind of scaffold up to that point, and even if you feel like you're too late, parents have so much shame around how they parent and things like that. Like, I don't think there's such thing as too late. Like, what's most important is repairing ruptures. But just to, like, depending on the age of your child, if you feel too late, just to name that, hey, I'm not going to force you ever to open up and talk with me. Like, I know that that's not going to be effective. But I just want to say that, like, just normalize that I want you to be able to express things to me with, that you don't feel like you have to protect me from burdening me with your problems. Like, that's my responsibility to take care of my emotions and feelings that arise. Like, here's the thing. All teenage boys that I talked to in my own Ph.D. research, they all desired a bit more emotional connection in their lives. And I'll speak specifically to fathers here. They love their fathers. So all of them highlighted how much they appreciated their father's work ethic and all these things, but there was one area of longing, and that area of longing was a bit more emotional closeness and connection with their fathers.
I believe it.
And that is going to feel awkward if there hasn't been a consistent stretch of time. It's going to be awkward for the father. It's going to be awkward for the son as well. And so it is like flexing a muscle. It's not like trying and forcing the vulnerability all at once. I don't know in your practice, like, I think therapists tell me, like, the doorknob approach, when people, like, share their deepest trauma or pain, like, right at the end of session, because then there's almost like a chance for vulnerability, but then they can escape later. Or if you're doing an activity with your son, and maybe it's like at the very end of the activity, then it gets vulnerable, but you did the whole activity where nothing was talked about.
Right. So well, for myself, I'm not a therapist, but I as my work in neuroscience and mental health, what you just said makes a lot of sense from what I know. You know, what you said, there's something around first being that pillar. I think that when I think about emotions and parents, it's not just the pillar, because obviously we can't always be strong, and there's a lot of pressure around that. But being emotionally resilient and putting the work into yourself first is what I'm hearing as well, because you know, so many parents, they have a new child, a newborn, and they're like, I got this, you know, it's easy. And the child is 2, and they're like, oof, okay, you know, things are coming up for me. This kid's having tantrums. And they have their second one. There's no time to take a pause. And then it becomes really hard, right? And that's when I think all of these aspects of your past kind of like not slap you in the face, but almost. It might feel that way in some circumstances. But I wonder if, you know, if we are speaking to the parents too right now, if a father in particular is hearing this, there's one thing that you said that really marked me. It was the second point that you said. I didn't have a chance to write
Fear
it,
of
but
being a burden?
yes, exactly. Thank you. So the fear of being that burden. I'm hearing you say this about the boys, and it makes complete sense. But this is what I hear over and over and over again from moms, in terms of them telling their own husbands, just talk to me about your emotions, just open up, which is what you said was not the best way to go about it with our teenage boys or our sons. But now we're doing this with our partners. What do you have in terms of, from your, experience and the work that you do, how do we approach it now as adults if we see that we have a partner who just doesn't want to be a burden, and we know they're going through a lot. I have dads who are part of the membership here at Curious Neuron as well, and they just talk about not wanting to put the financial stress on their partner because they have enough with a new baby and the kids, and they know that that's their part of the relationship. But then they don't want to they don't want to talk about anything, and they're always fine in quotes. So how do we begin that conversation as a couple?
I think the magic that needs to happen is, how do you approach a conversation around emotional vulnerability that feels like an invitation or something to get curious about, rather than feels like another way that I'm not enough because I'm not doing
Right.
this.
Yeah.
And I think for humans in general, a lot of us struggle with feelings of not enoughness. But I
Mm-hmm.
think when it comes to pressures around masculinity, where from a young age, masculine pressures are built around hierarchy of not enoughness, of how to measure up. There's going to be even deeper narratives that, like, okay, no, I need to be the shoulder to cry on,
Mm-hmm.
not the one crying on someone else's shoulder. And
Right.
because boys disconnection happens, emotional disconnection tends to happen at such a young age, that when we're adults, if we've had that emotional separation, for a disconnect for a long time, it's going to feel much more overwhelming to then try and dip your toes into vulnerability. And so there's like so many
I get
tensions
that.
and messiness that needs to be held here. The messiness is for men themselves to realize that by, so quote unquote, not burdening your partner, chances are you are also burdening your partner, because they're stressing about
Yes.
what you're not revealing and
Yeah.
all these
High
other
chances.
things. So it's
Yes.
like both. It's like, yeah, you're not
Yeah.
burdening them with some things, but then that itself, that's not a secret. I feel like, because there's negative connotations to that, but holding that in
Mm-hmm.
um, has consequences
Right.
in how you relate and closeness
Mm-hmm.
with one another. And there's also a messiness, is that if you start testing out being vulnerable, and I would highly encourage men themselves to say, like, if they could name that, like, I am not used to being vulnerable, or to start sharing the times where it was used against you in the past, to just
Right.
name that as a piece, that in itself can help your partner feel like they're understanding, like, why you have such a blockage here, as opposed to it being about, you need to share something deep now. It's like whatever's just on the surface about, like, here's why I actually don't feel like it's safe to be vulnerable
Mm-hmm.
with you. Like, maybe I tested that out with an ex partner, or maybe
Mm-hmm.
with you, and like, you laughed at me. It's like,
Sure. Yeah.
there's research that when men show emotions, that women can have reactions, negative reactions to
Mm-hmm.
that as well. Like, we all have different expectations. I've had a teenage boy tell me that the first and only time he ever saw his dad cry, the emotion that came up for him was disgust.
Mm.
And he's like, I just felt disgusted, like my dad is weak.
Right.
And we need to have understanding for the reality that them just being emotionally expressive, if they feel like they're just going to let the floodgates go, and there will be a bit less practice with how vulnerable to be or not, there could be a huge risk of a vulnerability hangover
Right.
from that. And so it's like just recognizing
Hmm.
that it's not just simply not talking about it.
Right. Yeah. I really like that advice. I think it's helpful to see it that way. And again, we're not having these conversations to point fingers. We're truly trying to be curious about what is happening, and just digging that way without saying like, what happened to you in your past. No, it's just really more the way you've expressed it is feels more attainable in terms of a conversation that might be uncomfortable and awkward, but we need to start having those.
And for partners approaching their husbands,
Mm.
I would there's a part of me that's like, is this mansplaining? But the part that I would encourage, or that I think is more effective, is to name what is coming up for you, of why you, like,
Hmm.
own it for yourself, like, do that U-turn for yourself of like, I I want to know what's stressing you out, because it actually, like, it makes me feel closer to you. Um, to know at least a little, let me in a little bit. is
Mm-hmm.
what I want. But also, this also gets back to this defensive part where, um, where a lot of people, but men especially, um, can have this narrative that they shouldn't be controlled, or they react to
Mm-hmm.
feeling a sense of control. So they feel like, oh, they're going to control my emotions, they're going to control my vulnerability or use it against me. Their defenses are going to go back up, and so there's this dance, and just naming the walls and the dance, and trying to own like what's coming up for us, being like,
Mm-hmm.
hey, when you wall up here, I know it might seem like I'm asking for too much. Um, yeah, approaching things with curiosity, but also for yourself.
Mm-hmm. I want to continue on the dads because I'm just really curious, but I want to go back just 1 second because you said that there were two critical periods. I think we only spoke about 5-year-olds. What's the second one?
The second time period I alluded to earlier is the transition from elementary school to high school.
Oh, right. Okay. Got it. Yes.
It's like around age 14. It's
Right.
when um, children get more peer oriented than
Mm-hmm.
parent oriented, care more what their peers think. Puberty comes in, there is more social insecurity. And so when there is less social stability, that's when
Mm.
posturing heightens. It's when, yeah, the pressures to fit in, boys themselves said, were heightened, was the hardest. They were the least authentic versions of themselves.
Around those years, when a child, any child becomes a teenager, like you said, it's such a huge transition and so difficult for many. What happens when I think I have two boys and a girl, and one is like me, more fearful around certain things, and we hesitate on parts of that. And I'm just picturing being a teenager around friends. If a child is more cautious around certain events, or again, all my own DNA, but how do we support the boy if he's a teenager at that point, knowing that I want you to be your authentic self, but at the same time, I don't want to push you, but I want you to try to push your boundaries because I know that I didn't do that growing up, and I know that that has led to me, not doing anything, not even roller coasters. I'm just afraid of everything. My kids laugh about that, but I want better, right, for my kids. How do we support them around anxiety and fear?
Yeah, you named exactly how resiliency is built. It's built through the presence of small enough challenges, but still some discomfort
Mm,
that they can then go back to and have this repertoire of like, oh, I've done hard things, I can do that again. And so you
right.
need to be building up those experiences. And I think that around that time period, we need to recognize that when boys get more emotionally restricted, it also correlates to why adults in America believe that raising boys are easier than raising girls, is
Hmm.
specifically because they think that boys are less emotional during the teenage years, especially.
Right.
And all evidence points that if you want to make an argument from like a scientific level, is that boys are
Mm,
more emotionally vulnerable and need more emotional support and guidance, especially when the world kind of backs away from them
mm.
during those years. And so they definitely need emotional support. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Dr. Mark Brackett's like ruler acronym of
Yes,
emotional
but let's share
intelligence,
it. Yeah.
which is like an acronym for like how you build emotional intelligence. And so I would use that. So ruler is
R-
like, so to recognize what emotions you're feeling, what's going on, understanding the cause and consequences of emotions. So like realizing that I might be feeling looks like I'm showing anger here, but it's actually because what just happened, I'm feeling shame. And when I feel shame, it
mm,
feels more important for me to lash out afterwards. So it's understanding those cause and consequences to emotions, not the cause and consequences of emotions of like when I'm angry, I hit things.
right.
Um, it's like understanding how that emotion even came to exist.
Hmm.
And so then L would be being able to label your emotions as clearly as possible. So as an adult, that's is why the work requires that you also understand your emotions to be
Hmm.
able to label them as specific as possible. It gives you language to understand your experience. So using that language, this goes back to something that you said early on, is that a lot of the males that you work with or men that you work with, like they know what anger is, or use that
Hmm.
example. And I work with like high risk, vulnerable male youth populations who all have this idea of anger, but I would say they know a very shallow view of anger. They know what anger in that rage, hyper aroused state is, but they don't know all the facets of anger. They don't know
Hmm.
what's healthy, what's really beneficial about anger. And so understanding each emotion and what it offers, like what's the role of anger? Like, for instance, anger is a great messenger system, but it's a pretty terrible communication system.
Right.
So it's great for, I
Yeah.
don't need to explain it further.
No, but the audience needs to hear that. And actually, I don't want to forget, but I want to link that after you're done with the ruler, because I think we need to remind everyone. But going into one of the reels that you had with anger and shame, but continue, and then I want to get into that.
Perfect.
Yeah.
And then so E is to express your emotions. And this isn't just talking about emotions. That could actually prevent us from expressing it. Some people need to work, though, at communicating and talking about their feelings. That can also be in a journal, expressing your feelings, expressing your emotions. But really, the main thing is like to feel your feelings,
Right.
because our emotions are stuck, they reside in our bodies, but we also have cognitive thoughts about our emotions. And so in order to express them, in order for them to shift and to move, it requires us to feel those things. And if our bodies haven't been safe places, and I think for a lot of men, because we get disconnected from certain emotional experiences at a very young age, it's like our minds intellectualizing, rationalizing, using so-called logic, which we also need to use the emotional centers of our brain to make so-called logical decisions. But this idea that we can be separate from our emotions and we view our emotions in our bodies is a huge disservice, and we need to get connected with how our bodies experience and feel emotions. I think one of the gifts about children at such a young age is they remind me how much feelings feel. And we get disconnected, like, oh, yeah, my body probably wants to have a little tantrum, but I've learned that that's not appropriate, and that makes sense as an adult. But there might be a little child within me that's like, oh, I actually feel things really deeply, and it can be scary to admit that you actually do feel things. And then the last R is regulate. So your ability to regulate emotions, and with your children, like co-regulation is the best. As a parent myself, the most humbling thing I realized as a so-called expert around emotions is that my emotional dysregulation has never led to my child's emotional regulation. It's like, no, me being emotionally dysregulated, maybe it's, I don't even know if it's actually even worked temporarily to stop them from having an emotion. It might have, I don't think I've even stopped them from having emotions. It's always made things worse.
Yeah. I get it. It's so hard. And that's why I say, like, as a parent, and that's why I'm specific to speaking to parents, because we can have any degree in even understanding emotions. And I don't know if this happened to you, where I went into this saying, like, I've got this. I'm good. And then I had 3 in under 4 years, and I was like, oh, this is much worse than I thought. This is not great. And I actually went through some mental health challenges by the time I had my third in under 4 years. The pandemic hit, and so for me, it was really tough. I was home with all 3 and just like breaking down every day and saying, like, I can't do this, and I'm a mess, and so on. So but it humbles you and you learn a lot about yourself. And even going back to therapy myself and realizing, like, oh shit, there were things that I didn't address, that, like, I was doing well with my husband, like, we were fine, but now that co-regulation piece reminds you that you need to learn how to regulate yourself, and many of us don't. Again, going back into my own childhood, like, I had 2 parents that had no idea how to regulate, that both struggled with mental health. And so the environment was, there's no space for emotions here. there's space for their emotions, because there's a lot, but not mine. And so it was a lot of understanding that and seeing how that applied to me as a parent, which is why I believe every single parent needs to learn emotion regulation skills at the beginning.
Thank you for sharing that. And can I just speak to that? Because something, I just want to like highlight how difficult this is. And something that you said, like, highlighted a feeling that I know I've had before, is that if we are, like, to actually show up emotionally well for our children does require us also to hold some tension and some critique often for how we were raised. And I do see that in a lot of the work that I do with men, is that there's almost all of them would agree that they wanted more emotional connection with their fathers, but they will give their fathers every excuse. And I totally get that. Like, we don't want so many of us don't want to overly criticize our parents because we feel like it's black or white, it's all or nothing. It's like, no, our parents, I believe like our parents were trying the best that they could.
They were, yes.
But it is a hang up I see for a lot of men, is like they will name the criticism, but then be like, oh, but it makes total sense. Like I didn't actually want that. They're going to minimize their own need and desire for emotional connection because that is more painful to admit that there is a need or longing there.
Yeah.
And that's really hard for some people.
Right. I want to be mindful of the time, and I knew this would be a hard conversation to end, but if a father's listening to this and has, you mentioned some deeper narratives. I had spoken to a father once who I said, it's okay to tell your kids, I'm sorry I lost it there. Like I'm really working hard on my emotions. And his response to that was, why would I show any weakness? I'm the authoritative figure in my child's life. And so I don't want to say I'm working on something. I should already know this. And I said, but you're human and we all are working. We're all a work in progress when it comes to our emotions. And I think that that's okay to show our kids, because then they don't expect perfection for themselves as well. And they know that it's a very messy journey in terms of emotions. What would you say to a father who, and if you could link it, maybe there's a father listening to this and feeling like anger is one of those emotions that are easy to express and show. And there's the shame that comes with it, that reel that you had. I've heard the scenario said to me from moms many times. There's a conversation back and forth, and it's like, well, what do you think? I'm the worst father. I'm the worst human. I'm not a good dad. And all the anger is coming up and the shame is underlying that. And it doesn't lead to an effective conversation and on both ends. Where can that father who really struggles with regulating that emotion, where does he begin? What can he do to work on that so that he can model that for his son and his kids?
It's ideal to work on emotional regulation when you're not in a state of dysregulation.
Yeah.
So like if you are though in a state of dysregulation when anger or rage comes up, and this is important for sons as well, because there's this narrative that even I held for longer than I'd like to admit after having done some research, is like I thought that angry boys, like there's some benefit in getting them to rage against things, but like so many empirical research shows that like their brains aren't cognitively developed enough to make sense of regulating through aggression. So like calming down, breathing exercises. If you exhale for longer than you inhale, that's one way to quickly activate the parasympathetic calming nervous system. Is that like research time and time again shows that slowing down is the way to regulate from anger, from a hyper aroused anger.
Right.
But if you're not in the dysregulated state, like how do you start approaching this? Is my favorite entry point for emotions and assessing our relationship with emotions is actually assessing the feelings we have about our feelings. Because rather than assess what's anger like, what's our relationship with anger, if you can reflect with a person or just with yourself, journal, reflect like, what's my feelings towards my anger? Because a lot of the boys and men that I work with that would be the stereotypical angry boys and men are actually quite afraid of their anger. And so that would be like an entry point for not trying to target the anger itself, but just being like, are you interested to understand your anger at all? And like, how do you feel towards the anger? And it's like, oh, I feel scared towards my anger because I don't know how to control it.
Right.
And it's kind of assessing emotional ideologues, like what are the beliefs that we have around emotions. And I still struggle with like, I know how important it is from such an academic perspective to express your feelings with someone that cares and can listen. But I still struggle with that. I still view sadness as a weakness when it gets to a certain point. Like if I can curate my emotional vulnerability, then I'm fine with it. But like, oh, if I get messy enough, if it's not curated enough, am I still lovable? Will that still be okay? And so getting curious about your feelings towards feelings would be one entry point.
I like that.
And just like shame is part of the problem. So shaming yourself around your emotions is going to prevent you from actually doing this. And the same thing for anyone that I'm talking to on this podcast. If we're like, oh, I'm not doing enough with my sons, like it's that shame response, like changes, you can probably speak to this more than me, but like you've probably heard of like don't should yourself.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, of how like
Yes,
that
we all
actually
do that.
makes us respond more
Hmm.
out of a fight or flight freeze response and makes us less likely to actually enact the change, rather than if we can
Hmm.
hold like, oh, I get to do this, or I can choose whether I do this or not,
Mm.
is really important. And that's something that we can model to our children, is that like if why it's so important for parents and fathers especially to reflect our emotional processes, being like, I'm actually not emotionally regulated right now, I need to calm myself down.
Hmm.
Maybe you have the capacity to do that together, breathing exercises, but maybe you actually need to go away.
Right.
That will impact boys much more than saying you this is how you do it. Because in my research, boys said that they learned the most about emotions from the men in their lives and how they responded to emotions. So like, are they going to be emotionally vulnerable? Are they going to show any sense of emotionality? Some of the boys looked at their fathers and they
Hmm.
had two thoughts. They thought, okay, my dad's this way, I don't see anything wrong with that, I'm going to try to be the same way. But they all knew that they were consciously suppressing their emotional parts of themselves.
Right.
And then the other group of boys looked at their dads and was like, oh, I see how that is impacting, or how his anger might come out, his rage might come out at times. I don't want to be the same as my dad in that emotional stage. But they also don't know, and they want more guidance on how to engage in their emotions. One of
Right.
the most telling things from my research that surprises a lot of schools that I go to talk to is that 80% of the boys I talk to in my PhD research said if they could change one thing about schools would be just having any emotional education. They wanted emotional education. And research shows, last thing from an educator point of view, is
Mm.
that social emotional learning in K to 7 has to have a very different approach than social emotional learning from high school. It's like the strategies can still be useful, but what they found is that you can teach younger kids these skills and they'll take it. But for high school kids and boys especially, is that so much of whether they're going to actually integrate and use a regulation strategy is if they think that there's coolness or status involved
Makes
in
sense.
doing the emotional regulation.
Mm. Brendan, what you just said, I think, is just so important. And I'm going to link your research and any studies that you think parents should read into the show notes. But as well, for those listening, there was an older podcast episode where I had summarized a study that looked at what you just said in terms of when parents, or specifically when dads, suppress their emotions, they're not modeling how to regulate an emotion for their child. And so I'm gonna get that study back out from where I have it somewhere in my list. But you just reminded me how important it is for us to kind of remind parents that, suppressing it and holding it in is not showing strength. So thank you so much for sharing that with me. And I enjoyed our conversation, and I think we'll have to have a part two. We're going to maybe take another opportunity to continue this conversation and see which conversations come up with the audience in terms of what we just said. So thank you again.
Thanks so much. That would be awesome.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation. I'd like to thank the Tannenbaum Open Science Institute as well as the McConnell Foundation. Both of these organizations support this podcast, and without them, this podcast would not be possible. Okay, so before we wrap up today's conversation, I just want to pull a few threads together from this conversation with Brendan and from some of the research that I've been reading lately. So, one thing that Brendan said that really stayed with me is that boys are deeply emotional and have emotionally rich inner lives. Even the boys who look shut down on the outside are often the most sensitive on the inside. They're constantly scanning who is it safe to be myself with, who might judge me, and who might I burden if I show how I really feel. It was really important for us to hear that as parents, because we don't realize sometimes, and I'm putting myself in this bucket, right, of things, or things we say, things we do, that we don't realize what it can lead to with our boys and with our kids. We don't want to intentionally cause any harm. Of course, I speak to so many parents that worry about that constantly. But I think as we are all here becoming a reflective parent, or on our journey to become a reflective parent, it's so important for us to step back every once in a while and assess what's going on in our lives, with our partners, with our kids, what's happening in their lives, what are they struggling with, where do we need to step back? And that to me is a reflective parent. It's not about saying, okay, this is working full force, let's go forward, and never look back and never pause and reflect. And thinking about our child's emotional development should look that way as well. When Brendan shared that every single teenage boy he spoke with wanted more emotional connection, especially with their dads, I truly felt that. Our boys are not asking us to be perfect, they're asking us to be present. And so I dug deep into the research and was curious to see what was out there. I found this study that I think is really important for all parents to hear. There was a study by Anne Cleary in 2022. And what they did is they interviewed men who had attempted suicide and had survived and asked them one question. What they asked all of these men were, can you tell me how you came to be admitted here? So this wasn't a huge survey study. It was literally one question. And whatever they answered, they recorded and looked at connections between what the men were sharing. And so what they found is that there were five distinct patterns or conversations that were being had with these men or topics. The first one is that many grew up in strict, emotionally restrictive masculine environments. And so the men described childhoods where emotional expression, especially sadness, fear, and vulnerability, were prohibited, and only strength or toughness was acceptable. These norms were reinforced not only by their fathers, but also by their peers and their community. The second theme that came up was father son relationships were often emotionally distant, rejecting, or abusive. So these men talked about their fathers being influential, but not nurturing. Many of the men here reported that there was an emotional distance between them and their father. There was rejection, harsh discipline, or violence, and alcoholism. These relational patterns clearly had created early feelings of sadness, anger, and rejection, and long term insecurity in these men. The third theme that came up was that men learned to hide vulnerability and cope through avoidance. So, due to strict masculine norms that these men had experienced growing up, they now, as adults, hid their emotions, avoided asking for help, coped through denial, emotional suppression with alcohol and drugs, or trying to tough it out. And this increased their internal distress and did not allow them to have early intervention since they were trying to cope with their own ways. Another theme that came up was that childhood adversity accumulated into a psychological burden carried into adulthood. So, adversity could be many things, but what they had talked about or experienced was childhood abuse, family conflict, traumatizing environments, and victimization at school. These experiences stacked over time and were never really processed because expressing pain was seen as weakness. And then the last one was when intimate relationships became strained or ended. These men felt especially vulnerable. So, because intimacy was the only place they allowed themselves to feel emotionally safe in those moments, relationship conflict or loss created overwhelm and emotional threat. I want you to think about this one. If your partner shuts down very easily, there's just so much in this study that we can talk about and discuss, but it is truly important for us to remember that early environment will shape how we as adults cope with our emotions. And so I think that for dads that are listening to this, or if you're listening to this as partners, emotional restriction is not protection. It increases long term vulnerability. We don't want our kids to hide their emotions. Unfortunately, many of us are not comfortable with our children expressing emotions, or we don't know how to support them in coping with it. And so it's really hard to know what to do. And which is why, by the way, I'm building this course and I had the Reflective Parent Club. I work with people privately as well because I just feel that there are so many parents out there that don't need more parenting advice. They truly need emotional support and learning how to cope with their emotions. What we have to remember also is that boys need safe spaces to express sadness, fear, and shame. Next is that the father son emotional connection actually is protective. I want all of us to truly sit with this episode and reflect on how important it is. I hope that we can continue this conversation together. Thank you so much to all of you for being here, for listening to this podcast. Please make sure that you are subscribed. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with somebody who needs to hear this. Thank you for being here. I'll see you next Monday, and we will be having our 250th episode. Bye.